Imagine the sound of the steppe. For thousands of years, warfare in the heart of Asia was defined by a specific auditory landscape. The thundering rhythm of hooves, the whistle of arrows cutting through the dry air, the clash of steel against leather and mail, and the guttural cries of men and horses. This was the symphony of the Mongol Empire, a force of nature that swept out of Mongolia in the 13th century to consume the known world. They were the masters of mobile warfare, an army built on speed, discipline, and the terrifying efficiency of the composite bow. They were the unstoppable force. But in the early years of their expansion, as they pushed south into the fortified heartlands of northern China, the unstoppable force met something entirely alien. They met the dragon. They met the thunder that shakes the heavens. They met gunpowder. To understand the sheer psychological and physical shock of this moment, we must first understand the mindset of the Mongol warrior. These were men raised in the saddle, accustomed to a world where death was delivered by kinetic energy, a sword cut, an arrow puncture, a trampling horse. These were threats they understood. They could see the arrow coming, they could parry the sword. They were the apex predators of a world defined by muscle and iron. When they descended upon the Jin dynasty in northern China, they expected a difficult fight, for the Jin were powerful and heavily fortified, but they expected a fight that followed the laws of nature as they knew them. The Jin dynasty, however, was fighting for its survival with the desperation of a cornered animal and the ingenuity of a civilization that had unlocked the secrets of chemistry. The Chinese alchemists had been experimenting with saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal for centuries, initially searching for an elixir of immortality, but finding instead a recipe for destruction. By the time Genghis Khan turned his gaze south, black powder had evolved from a curiosity into a weapon. The first true encounters were likely confusing skirmishes, moments where the air suddenly smelled of rotten eggs and brimstone, where flashes of unnatural light disrupted the night. But the defining moment, the trauma that would sear itself into the Mongol consciousness, came during the great sieges of the major Chinese cities. Picture the scene at the siege of a major Jin stronghold. The Mongol Tumans, the organized units of 10,000 men, have surrounded the city. They have set up their trebuchets, their traction catapults, ready to batter the walls down as they had done to countless cities before. They are confident. They are the scourge of God. Then, from the ramparts of the desperate city, comes a sound that drowns out the war drums. It is not the twang of a bowstring. It is a roar. The Jin defenders unleashed what they called the heaven-shaking thunder. These were not the firearms of the modern era, precise and mechanical. These were cast-iron casings filled with gunpowder, essentially primitive fragmentation grenades, but on a scale the world had never seen. When the fuse was lit and the projectile hurled from a catapult or dropped from a wall, the result was cataclysmic. For a Mongol warrior standing near the impact zone, the experience was beyond comprehension. First, the flash, brighter than the midday sun, blinding and disorienting. Then, the shockwave. The explosion didn't just kill, it concussed. It turned the air itself into a weapon. And then came the shrapnel. The iron casing shattered into jagged shards that tore through the heavy silk undershirts and leather armor of the Mongols as if they were paper. But it was the noise that truly terrified them. Historical chronicles from the time describe the sound of these detonations as being audible for 30 miles. To a superstitious people who worshiped the eternal blue sky, this was not just technology, this was the wrath of the spirits. It was thunder brought down to earth. Horses, the lifeblood of the Mongol army, would have been sent into absolute panic. A horse can be trained to ignore the clash of swords, but the sudden, ear-splitting boom of an explosion is a primal terror. The disciplined formations of the Mongols would have disintegrated as their mounts reared and fled, throwing riders and breaking the cohesion that was the secret to their success. The initial reaction of the Mongols was almost certainly fear. It is a human reaction to the unknown. When you face a weapon that breathes fire and strikes with invisible force, you pause. There are accounts of Mongol generals, men who had never known defeat, hesitating before the walls of these smoke-shrouded cities. The smoke itself was a weapon, a thick, choking fog that obscured the battlefield and burned the eyes and throat. It turned the battlefield into a hellscape, where the enemy could not be seen, only heard and felt. However, if the story ended with the Mongols fleeing in terror, history would look very different. The genius of the Mongol military machine was not its brutality, but its adaptability. This is the crux of their reaction. They did not retreat into the steppes, denouncing this black magic. They did not cower. They observed. Genghis Khan and his greatest general, Subutai, possessed a pragmatic ruthlessness that transcended superstition. They watched their men die by fire and explosion, and instead of despairing, they asked a simple question: how do we get that? The transition from victim to master was rapid. The Mongols realized that this new power was not magic but engineering. As they captured Jin cities, they did not just loot the gold and grain, they hunted for the artisans, they spared the engineers, they tortured and bribed the alchemists until the secret of the black powder was theirs. This marked a profound shift in the Mongol reaction. The initial shock turned into a covetous hunger. They realized that this technology was the key to breaking the one thing that slowed them down: fortifications. The Mongols were masters of the open field, but walled cities were a nuisance. Sieges were long, costly affairs that drained manpower and slowed the momentum of conquest. Gunpowder changed the equation. By the time of the siege of Kaifeng in 1232, the dynamic had shifted. The Jin defenders were using their most advanced weaponry, the flying fire lances. These were tubes of bamboo or paper, filled with powder and attached to a spear. When lit, they spewed a jet of flame for several feet, acting as a primitive flamethrower. They could burn a man to death inside his armor. They also used the thunder crash bombs on chains, lowering them down the walls to explode amidst the Mongol sappers digging at the foundations. The carnage at Kaifeng was horrific. The Mongol casualties were staggering. Men were incinerated, blown apart, and crushed. But by this point, the Mongol reaction was no longer one of surprise. It was a calculated attrition. They wore cowhide shields to protect against the flames. They dug trenches to shield themselves from the shrapnel. They learned the range of the weapons and stayed just outside of it until the moment was right to star. Ike. They were analyzing the weapon in real time. When Kaifeng fell, the Mongols did not destroy the workshops. They absorbed them. This is one of the most important moments in military history. The Mongols took the Chinese invention, which had primarily been used for defense, and they weaponized it for offense and mobility. They created a specialized corps of artillerymen. They realized that if a bomb could be thrown from a wall to kill an attacker, it could be thrown from a trebuchet to kill a defender. The reaction of the Mongols to gunpowder evolved from fear to fascination to mastery. They became the vectors of this technology. As the Mongol horde turned its attention westward towards the Islamic world in Europe, they brought the dragon with them. Imagine the reaction of the Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, or, later, the European Knights in Hungary and Poland. They had not grown up next to China. They had no context for black powder. When the Mongols arrived at the Battle of Mohi in 1241, they used smoke bombs and grenades to disorient the Hungarian knights. The Europeans wrote of a demonic fog and fire that creates a thunderous noise. The Mongols, who had once been the ones terrified by the noise, were now the ones orchestrating the symphony of destruction. They used the noise to herd the enemy, to create panic, to mask their flanking maneuvers. They had taken the weapon that nearly stopped them and made it an integral part of their tactical doctrine. The Mongols' relationship with gunpowder continued to evolve. They didn't just use what they found, they improved it. Under the Yuan dynasty, established by Kublai Khan, the technology took a leap forward. The bamboo tubes of the fire lances were replaced with metal. This was a crucial innovation. Bamboo bursts if the pressure is too high. Metal contains the pressure, allowing for a more powerful explosion and, eventually, the propulsion of a projectile. This leads us to the birth of the hand cannon. The Heilongjiang hand cannon, one of the earliest known firearms, dates from the Mongol Yuan period. It is a crude bronze tube, but it is undeniably a gun. It represents the final stage of the Mongol reaction to gunpowder. They had gone from facing it as a terrifying external threat to holding it in their hands as a standard-issue weapon. The invasion of Japan by Kublai Khan offers another fascinating glimpse into this technological integration. When the Mongol fleets arrived in Hakata Bay, they unleashed explosive bombs. Japanese scrolls from the period depict these devices: ceramic shells filled with gunpowder and shrapnel exploding in the air above the samurai. The samurai, much like the Mongols decades earlier, were bewildered. Their code of Bushido, focused on individual duels and archery, had no answer for an exploding shell. The Mongols had effectively exported the trauma they experienced in northern China to the shores of Japan. However, we must look deeper at the cultural reaction. The Mongols were a shamanistic people. They believed in spirits of the earth, water, and sky. How did they reconcile this chemical warfare with their spiritual worldview? It appears they viewed it as a harnessing of elemental forces. Fire was sacred to the Mongols. It was a purifier. Gunpowder, in a sense, was the ultimate expression of fire. It was not seen as unnatural in the way a modern observer might view a chemical weapon, but rather as a hyper-potent form of a natural element. By controlling the heaven-shaking thunder, the Khans were demonstrating that their mandate to rule came from the sky itself. They wielded the thunder of the Tengri. There is a grim irony in the Mongol adoption of gunpowder. The Mongols were the ultimate expression of the nomadic way of life. They were the horse lords. Their power came from the pasture, the bow, and the horse. But gunpowder is the weapon of the sedentary. It requires laboratories, mining, metallurgy, and supply chains. You cannot make gunpowder on the back of a horse while galloping across the steppe. You need cities. You need industry. By embracing gunpowder, the Mongols inadvertently sowed the seeds of the end of their own way of life. The cannon and the musket would eventually become the tools that sedentary empires, the Russians, the Qing Chinese, the Ottomans, would use to close the open steppe and end the dominance of the nomad. The weapon the Mongols reacted to, adopted, and spread would eventually destroy the very military ecosystem that created them. But in those early days, in the dust and blood of the Jin campaigns, there was no foresight of this decline. There was only the immediate, visceral reality of war. The Mongol reaction was a testament to their supreme pragmatism. A lesser army would have broken. Many armies did break. When the Crusaders later faced Mamluk gunpowder, or when the Aztecs faced Spanish muskets, the psychological shock often led to collapse. The Mongols were unique because they possessed a learning curve that was vertical. Let us return to the visceral experience of the Mongol soldier. We must imagine the veteran of the campaigns. He started his career fighting tribes in Mongolia with a bow and a saber. He rode south and saw the great stone walls of China. He saw the sky light up with artificial fire. He saw his comrades torn apart by invisible forces. He survived. And 10 years later, he is standing outside the walls of Baghdad or Kiev. He is no longer the one looking up in fear. He is standing next to a Chinese engineer. He is watching the fuse burn down. He knows exactly what is going to happen. He covers his ears, not in terror, but in preparation. He watches the walls of a civilization, thousands of years old, crumble in a cloud of gray smoke. He has become the master of the new age. The Mongol reaction to gunpowder was not a singular event, it was a process. It was a journey from the receiving end of a weapon of mass destruction to the deployment of that weapon on a continental scale. They were the bridge between the medieval and the modern. They took a Chinese alchemical curiosity and turned it into the arbiter of empires. We often think of the Mongols as barbarians, as destroyers of culture, but in their reaction to gunpowder, we see them as supreme innovators. They were not rigid, they were fluid like water, taking the shape of the vessel they were poured into, and if that vessel contained high explosives, they became an explosive force. The legacy of that first encounter is still with us. Every time a cannon fired at Waterloo, every time a shell exploded at the Somme, it was an echo of that first terrifying boom on the plains of northern China. The Mongols were the first global power to look into the barrel of the gun, and rather than blink, they reached out and took it. The narrative of the Mongol conquest is usually told through the lens of generals and maps, but if we zoom in to the granular level, to the smell of sulfur and the flash of nitrates, we see a different story. We see a clash of eras, the ancient world of muscle and bone colliding with the chemical world of energy and reaction. The Jin dynasty engineers who lit those first fuses could not have known what they were unleashing. They hoped to save their city. Instead, they armed their executioners. They gave the Mongols the one thing they lacked, the power to shatter stone. And what of the horses? The Mongol pony, the unsung hero of the empire. Their reaction must not be overlooked. These animals, bred for the silent stalk and the sudden sprint, had to be conditioned to the roar of artillery. The Mongols, excellent horsemen, likely spent months desensitizing their mounts to the flash and the bang. This training process alone shows the commitment the Mongols had to this new warfare. They fundamentally altered their relationship with their most trusted companions to accommodate this new god of war. The psychological dominance the Mongols achieved with gunpowder cannot be overstated. In Europe, the church bells would ring in terror at the approach of the Tartars. But it wasn't just the arrows they feared, it was the smoke. The Mongols learned to use the sulphurous clouds to mask their movements, creating a theatricality of terror. They became monsters in the mist. This was a direct application of their first experiences. They remembered how the smoke had confused them, so they used it to confuse others. They remembered how the noise had panicked them, so they used it to break the morale of European knights, who believed such sounds could only come from hell. In the end, the question of how the Mongols reacted to gunpowder is a study in human resilience and ingenuity. It is a story of how the most traditional, archaic warrior culture on Earth came face to face with the future, and instead of rejecting it, devoured it. They proved that the most dangerous weapon is not the bomb itself, but the mind that is willing to use it. The Mongols did not invent gunpowder, but they were the ones who truly understood its potential. They respected its power because they had felt its burn. And in doing so, they changed the nature of warfare forever. As the smoke cleared over the ruins of the Jin capital, the world had changed. The age of the castle was beginning to end. The age of the knight was living on borrowed time. The Mongols, dusting the ash from their silk robes, mounted their horses and turned west, carrying the secret of the fire drug in their saddlebags. The silence of the steppe was gone, replaced by the ringing in their ears, a sound that would eventually grow to consume the entire world. The dragon had been tamed, and the Mongols were riding it. This transformative period also highlights the meritocratic nature of the Mongol war machine. In many armies of the time, a captured enemy was a slave or a corpse. In the Mongol army, a captured enemy with a skill was a recruit. When they first faced the Thunder Crash bombs, they didn't see heretics, they seen potential assets. A Chinese engineer who knew the ratio of charcoal to saltpeter was worth his weight in gold. He was given status, food, and protection, provided he turned his tubes and mixtures against his former masters. This intellectual absorption was the key. The Mongols didn't need to understand the chemistry themselves, they just needed to own the chemists. It is fascinating to consider the conversations that must have occurred in the war tents of the Khans. The grizzled veterans of the steppe, men who worshipped the sky and the sword, sitting across from the scholarly Chinese engineers, discussing the trajectory of fire pots and the burning time of fuses. Two worlds, utterly distinct, fusing together to create a juggernaut. This fusion is evident in the siege of Baghdad in 1258. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, brought with him a massive corps of Chinese artillery engineers. They had traveled thousands of miles, crossing mountains and deserts, bringing their strange powders and tubes to the heart of the Islamic world. When the bombardment of Baghdad began, it was the culmination of that first shock in China decades earlier. The palm trees of the Tigris shook with the concussions of Chinese gunpowder delivered by Mongol will. The walls that had stood for centuries fell in days. The reaction was complete. The assimilation was total. So, when we ask how they reacted, we must say, they reacted with a terrifying openness of mind. They reacted with a lack of ego. They did not cling to the old ways when the new ways proved superior. They were ruthless Darwinists of the battlefield. If it worked, they used it. If it killed, they wanted it. The history of military technology is often a history of resistance. Generals are often the last to accept change, clinging to the tactics of their youth. The cavalry laughed at the tank. The battleship admirals dismissed the aircraft carrier. But the Mongols, often portrayed as primitive, showed a sophistication that shamed later generations. They recognized the paradigm shift instantly. The first time they saw a man explode, they didn't call it unfair. They called it the future. And as the Mongol Empire eventually fractured and dissolved into the history books, the gunpowder they carried remained. It found its way into the hands of the Ottomans, the Mamluks, and the Europeans. The recipe for the black powder, carried across the Silk Road under the protection of the Pax Mongolica, sparked the renaissance of warfare that would lead to the modern world. Thus, the echo of that first explosion in North China is still expanding. The Mongols were the medium. They were the terrifying delivery system that inoculated the world with the virus of gunpowder. Their reaction, that pivot from fear to utilization, is the reason the world looks the way it does today. They looked into the flash of the explosion and saw a new world order, and with characteristic speed, they raced to claim it.